hope and hopelessness. I think these are two of the most powerful elements of the human experience, aren't they? Hope is that looking forward with expectation to a bright future. Hope is that thing that says tomorrow is going to be okay. It's going to be okay. Somehow, the world actually looks different when we view it through the lens of a hopeful future, doesn't it? Things look different. The light is lighter. The color's more vivid. We can almost taste the budding of what the future will bring. But we know the opposite too, don't we? Many of you, I don't need to convince you what despair feels like. We choke out those words. Maybe it's just even in our own hearts. We never even can say it out loud, those words, I give up. I'm done. You know what hopelessness feels like? You know, when I talk to people who are dealing with loss, just are grieving deep things, when I talk with people who are working through major clinical depression, I often hear in their language, the only language they seem to be able to say that's getting close is the language of death. It just feels like something has died inside of me, like the hope is dried up completely. I hear that language, you know, I've even experienced it myself at times. That sense that hopelessness feels almost like a death of something. You know, if you're anything like me, you probably know what it's like to fight against hopelessness as well, and to fight vigorously too. It takes me about 20 minutes of reading the BBC World News, and that's a news source that is generally not given to being overly dramatic, right? It's pretty straightforward reporting. Give me 20 minutes of reading about Boko Haram and abducted children, about the violence that's just unthinkable in its proportions in our world today, about children and women in slavery of all kinds, about political power plays. 20 minutes, and I'm already feeling those waves of hopelessness. What can I do? The questions that come to mind. What even can be done? And then I start asking questions of God too, like why and what? And where are you in that? At this moment is when I'm often tempted to start thinking and living in the way that many of my peers have adopted. We could sometimes describe it as a playfulness. It sort of says, well, if there is no truth, capital T, and there's no overarching story that makes sense of our stories, we're just going to have to almost naively shut everything else out and play. Just make the best of it. You know, I was sitting in Starbucks a couple weeks ago working on a different sermon, but this song came on, and I thought, wow, that's really interesting. Ingrid Michaelson, her song, You and I, here's what she sings to her lover. Don't you worry there, my honey. We might not have any money, but we've got our freaking stupid love to pay the bills. Now, I didn't say the words were particularly intelligent. But then the chorus. Oh, let's get rich and buy our parents' homes in the south of France. Let's get rich and give everybody nice sweaters and teach them how to dance. You know what? That's an attractive vision of life, isn't it? That's why it sells albums. I could buy into that. Yeah, you know what? I think my mom would love a home in the south of France, and you would all like nice sweaters and a dance lesson. And seriously though, I could see myself buying into this stance toward life. To say, basically, I am just going to just make the best of it. Sort of shut out the hopelessness of my world. Focus on a few very small things for me and my tribe. Think of that TV's 90 shows Friends. It's all just about me and my little circle and what we get out of our life for ourselves, and that's it. And forget the rest of the world. I could choose to live in sort of playful naivety about the world around me. To turn away from, play is good, don't get me wrong here. Actually, playfulness is a very good thing as well. But when it becomes a turning away from and a denial of real life, and I simply replace real life with a vision that's centered on making the best of it for me and my own little tribe, I'm just playing games with reality at this point. And now I'm not the only one seeing this either. A couple weeks ago, I quoted the Princeton philosopher Cornel West. He's going to be coming to TRU this week coming up, and it's going to be great. You can get tickets at the TRU SU. They didn't pay me to say that, but they're free. Just pick them up. I'm going to be there. He says this: too many young folk have addiction to superficial things and not enough conviction about substantial things like justice, truth, and love. Notice he doesn't say all young people. That wouldn't be true. I know a lot of young people who are deeply committed to those things. But I think he's right. We can become addicted. And that's a strong word, I know, but I think it's the right one. We can become addicted to the superficial things that keep us from justice, from giving advantage to the disadvantaged. They can keep us from love and from truth. He doesn't say all young people, of course not, and I don't think it's limited to younger generations either, but I think it's particularly, it's showing up in particularly acute ways in my generation because of the rejection of anything like an overarching story. But do we have just these two options? Despair on the one hand or denial on the other? Our text today is interesting. It radically recognizes the bitter pain of loss, the sense of hopelessness that can result from it. It looks directly into the eyes of hopelessness, but instead of opting for denial or staying in despair, the words of God bring new life and hope. As we've been working through the storyline of the Bible this fall, we've seen that God creates humanity, the rest of the world, for relationship with Him, with others, and with the rest of the created order. But in the second scene, the next sort of portrait that Genesis shows us, it actually all comes crumbling apart. And the relationship with God, others, and nature begins to unravel. But even just before that, we see that when God creates humanity, it says that He breathes into them life. What makes humans human, it seems, is that God breathes His Spirit into us, and we become, the man, it says, becomes a living being at that point. This is something significant about humanity. It doesn't say that about the animals, but God breathes His Spirit into the humans. We become a living being. But something has come unraveled. And how does the unraveling occur? It occurs as humanity disbelieves the love of God and instead chooses to turn away from God as our loving leader. As humanity puts themselves at the central place, we become our own masters. And since that time, every human has done the same thing, the scriptures tell us. We all have sought to become our own masters, to do life on our own terms. But this isn't the end of the story, praise be to God. No, God loves humanity, loves His creation too much. So God had promised these first people that if they turn away from Him, it will lead to their death. And they must now leave the Garden of Eden, the place that they were in perfect relatedness with God, each other, and nature. They are exiled from their place of being with God. And then we see that the evil in their hearts that begins, it keeps growing, and chaos is mounting. It's the sort of chaos, I think, that leads to what we see in our world today. So how will this story end? Will there be hope for a return from exile? To experience again the wonderful presence of God in its fullness. How will this story end? Or is this a hopeless story, or will there be return from exile? That's the big story that we're looking at this fall in a nutshell. Our text today specifically focuses in on the people of Judah, on God's people. But it mirrors the larger story, I think, of our exodus, of humanity's exodus from the presence of God and what God is up to. So in this way, we see that we're bound up in the story of Ezekiel 37. As we look at this text, we're going to actually have to look in three directions. We'll look back. We'll see the hope that Israel itself experienced in this text. Then we'll look at our own present time and say, what is our hope for now? But then we'll also be oriented to the future. What is the hope for the future? So three things we'll look at. Hope for then, hope for now, hope for tomorrow, hope for the future. First, hope then. As we've seen so far in our story, God called one family through which he would bring back all families to himself. That was the promise. And this family of Israel, they're called to reflect and resemble God to the rest of creation. They're called to be a light to the nations. But as we've seen in our study, they've failed in this mission. Rather than honoring God's name among the nations, they've actually trashed God's name. And people, when they look at the people of Israel, go, well, their God is obviously not the real God, because look at the way that their lives are in chaos. Okay, so they're meant to reflect and resemble God, and they've done the exact opposite. They've trashed his name. They've worshipped false gods, and they've joined their worship of idols to injustice and violence at the human level, at the horizontal, relational level. They failed to love God, and that led to their failure to love others as well. But God doesn't give up on them. For 200 years, he sends prophets. And their basic message is this: stop running from God and run to him instead. If you don't, it will end in disaster. And that wasn't an empty threat. Okay? The end in disaster was not an empty threat. Now, if you have young kids like I do, you know it's easy to make empty threats. Okay? If you don't stop hitting your brother, or so it often goes in our family, you're going to have to sit in calm down corner for 3 minutes. But what happens when they do keep hitting their brother? It's not always easy to follow through, is it? One, because you love your kids and you want them to be playing, and they kind of, and two, it's really hard to keep a 2-year-old in timeout. So, empty threats are easy to make, but God is not going to raise spoiled kids. His justice demands that what he says, he will follow through on, and he does. God makes good on this promise that if they keep running away, it will end in disaster, and it does. Jerusalem, the city that was built at Solomon's temple within that city, represents God's presence among his people. Both God allows the Babylonians to destroy them utterly, to just break them into ruins. And the people of God are carried off into Babylon, into exile. And it's there that Ezekiel is. He's one of these exiles, carried off. And God has spoken to Ezekiel and says, Ezekiel, I have a message for you to give the rest of the exiles. And it's a long book, and it's not a simple book to read. I read through it and wrestled again with it this week a lot. But here he is, Ezekiel, sitting by the Kebar River in Babylon, and the word of the Lord comes to him. And I want to pick up at chapter 37, verses 1 to 14. It says this: the hand of the Lord was on me, Ezekiel says, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were dry, very dry. He asked me, Son of man, can these bones live? Imagine that you're there with Ezekiel, seeing the scene that he sees. In fact, this text is recorded the way it is so that we would see it with our mind's eye. Put yourself there. You're walking through this valley full of bones, human bones. Great many of them, very dry. And then the question comes, can these bones live? What would you answer? One time we were having a... Good answer. Absolutely not. Of course not. We were having a white elephant gift exchange just out there with our young adults about, 5 years ago, Bethany, something like that. There's about a dozen of us. So it was, before we were like 90 people crammed in this room. There's about a dozen of us, and it was my turn to choose, and I went for it because, of course, the biggest present is always the best present, right? So I choose the big one, big box, like this size. It kind of smells funny. So I'm excited. I open up the box, and in the box, wonder of wonders, is a horse's vertebral column. Yes, our very own Bethany Garrett, soon to be wifed at the end of next week here. Very exciting. Bethany Garrett dug it out of the swamp at her home in Pritchard and put it in a box, and I opened it. Can these bones, dry bones, live? My answer is, of course not. Of course they can't. They're deader than dead, these dry bones. So God asks Ezekiel, can these bones live? Here's what Ezekiel says. Sovereign Lord, you alone know. From a human standpoint, of course, in the balcony there, the answer is no. Then he said to me, verse 4, prophesy. That just simply means speak my word. It doesn't mean foretell the future events. Very, very infrequently in the Old Testament does it mean something like that. It means speak my word. Speak my word to them. To the dry bones. Say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make my breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come on you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you'll know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I was commanded. And as I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound. The bones, they came together, bone to bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, son of man, which is just another way of saying mortal. Prophesy, mortal. Say to the breath, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Come, breath, from the four winds, and breathe into these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded. And breath entered them, and they came to life and stood on their feet, a vast army. This picture, to our modern sensibilities, we might say is terrifying, maybe even grotesque. I have a friend who's here, Stephen Casson. He makes films. If we made this into a film, Stephen, what sort of genre would it be? Avant-garde? Surrealist? What sort of music would we have to choose if we were to accurately represent this scene? I think it would have to be quite haunting, to be truthful. It seems to me, this valley of dry bones, it looks like the aftermath of a great valley, actually of a great slaughter, and here's what's left over several years later. But then these bones, they start rattling as they come together, sinews and flesh and skin wrapping around the skeletal figures. It might be scary. I don't think I'd let my kids watch that film. And then this vast army of lifeless beings, they await the breath of God. The breath comes, and now the vast army is standing to life. But what is this all about even? Verse 11. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up. Our hope is gone. We are cut off. Therefore prophesy to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my spirit in you. Breath and spirit. It's ruach. It's the same word in Hebrew. It's pneuma, same word in Greek as well. I will put my spirit, my breath in you, and you will live. And I will settle you on your land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord. So here's God's people. They're in exile. They're cut off. They are feeling hopeless, away from the familiar. And their hopelessness, they say, feels like death, like dry bones. Our hope is dead, they're saying. What hope do God's people have of reviving themselves in this moment? Well, as much hope as you and I have of making those horse bones come to life again. Absolutely none. But notice the death that God speaks of here isn't a literal death. It's a symbol. It's a picture of hopelessness. And the resurrection, again, is a symbol of God's leading his people back to their home. It's a symbol of their return from exile. And God, we find out, is faithful. You see, we'll find this out in the next couple weeks, that God changes the heart of Babylon's king. And he actually sends the people back to rebuild Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple. Yes, God is good on his word. God keeps his promises. He does it. But here's what we need to see. Something has to die to be reborn. Notice, for the people of Israel, they were willing to name their loss. They say, our hope is gone. It's dead. It's over. Our hope is gone. They named their loss. We're cut off, and they were. Any grief counselor will tell you, if you've experienced loss, simply denying it, pretending it's not there, whether it's the loss of a loved one, the breakdown of a marriage or a significant relationship, the loss of your health, loss of your career, there is no moving forward. There's no hope for a new future without actually understanding and being honest about what has been lost. We have to name the loss. If there's any hope for revival, for resurrection to a new way of life, we need to name that there's death there too. And here's how we can see that this text is not just a word of hope for then, but a word of hope for now. We too, like the people of Israel in exile, we need to be honest and acknowledge our sense of loss and hopelessness when it comes. Pretending everything's fine, putting on a kind of a happy, slappy attitude is not going to be helpful in the long run. You know, I have a picture of my dad up on our fridge at home. And he's wearing my ball cap. We're in a canoe at White Lake. And White Lake is our favorite lake to fish when I was living in Salmon Arm. To fish all day and not catch any fish. But in this picture, he's got a fish, and it's a good one. And he's wearing a big smile as well. And I often hold our 2-year-old son, Adam, in my hands. And we look at this picture on the fridge. Actually, just about every morning, we're just looking at the fridge because it's like 5:30. I'm half asleep. And I say, Grandpa Ross, I tell him, and he tries to say his name. And in that moment, I have to negotiate, again, between hope and hopelessness. Almost every day I stand there with Adam, I have to wrestle with these two options. See, my dad passed away in 2009. It was 2 years before our first was born. He never got to meet our boys. They never got to meet him. That feels like a sort of death that has to happen. A death to the sort of supposed to be of life that we had envisioned. See, it wasn't just that I had to accept the loss of my dad once and then I could kind of open the way for a new future. Well, that had to happen, yes. But it actually has to happen on an ongoing basis. I have to negotiate and renegotiate between hope and hopelessness almost every day. Will I believe the good news? That there is hope, that there is life after this life? Or do I despair? Do I believe Jesus, that there is a resurrection to life, that my kids will actually meet Grandpa Ross one day? I have to work through that. Or I have to despair and say the world is absurd and we're just a mess within it, and so I give up. I negotiate hope and hopelessness all the time. You might be going through something right now. Something that's obvious to others, or maybe it's so deep that you yourself can hardly name it. I believe that God is big enough to raise the dead in me and in you too. That God can speak to your valley of dry bones, sense of hopelessness. That he will breathe his spirit into your sense of hopelessness and bring new life. It won't be everything as it was, of course not. But it will be resurrection to a new possibility, to a new way of life. Some of you have lost significant relationships recently. It feels like a sort of death in you. You don't have to minimize that. You really don't. You don't have to pretend that it doesn't feel like death. But there's an invitation. Look at the valley of dry bones and see that God can do the impossible. He can raise the dead. He can bring life into a situation that looks lifeless. Yes, this text speaks of hope now, hope in our circumstances, but here's what we really have to see. It's more than just our dealing with loss and grief. This text is essential for us to grasp in terms of the much larger return from exile, our return from hopelessness to new life. Paul, I think, is drawing heavily on Ezekiel 37 when he writes Ephesians chapter 2. He is finding in the prophecy of Ezekiel 37 its fullest fulfillment at the coming of Jesus. He sees in Ezekiel 37 the picture of humanity and the way of new life. Look at Ephesians 2:1 with me. As for you, Paul says, and the you is everyone in the Christian community there, and I think through all of eternity. He says, as for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins. Now, we might be tempted to compare ourselves to others and be like, you know what? I'm a pretty good person when I compare myself to him or to her, so I must be okay with God. But Paul makes it clear, you, actually we, all of us, we were dead, like dry bones dead. Because just like Adam and Eve, we walked away from God as our master and our king. And now because of our sin, our attempts to live life apart from God and all the fallout from it, we are dead spiritually. We don't just need a little tune-up of our souls, a little bit of self-help to make things new. No, I'm dry bones dead. No hope of life. As God asked Ezekiel, can these bones live? The answer is the same. As Paul puts it again in Ephesians 2, like the rest, he says, the rest of humanity who too are dead in our transgression sins, like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath. Wow. But, let's stop here. But, this word right here, this little 3-letter word is almost too wonderful. But, it's the most important word in the whole Bible. I'm not exaggerating either. This right here is the most important word in the Bible. You were dead, but you were deserving of God's wrath. But what? But even though there was no hope for us to revive our dry bones, there's nothing I can do to make these bones live. But in light of all that, but because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ. Even when we were dead in our transgressions, it is by grace you have been saved. Grace. Sheer gift. In the middle of our dry bones hopelessness, in our utter deadness of heart and soul, grace. Totally undeserved. Totally unearned. Grace means gift. God gives. Out of his great love for us, this gift. Life. Resurrection from our deadness. Resurrection to new life. Resurrection, just like for the people of Israel, a return from exile, from life apart from God. Do you know that apart from Jesus, you are dry bones dead inside? Do you know that? I love the way that the Rend Collective band in the UK puts it. They sing this, all I am is dry bones without you, Lord. A desert soul. I'm lost without your creative spark in me. I'm dead inside unless your resurrection sings. Yes, here's the beginning of hope. Something has to die to find new life. It's the death to the notion that I could live real life apart from God. A death to my old life of self-centeredness and self-focus. It's out of that place of recognizing my need for him that he can breathe new life by his Spirit. See, until we recognize my utter hopelessness in my spirit, just how dead I am, I can't embrace a new future. I can't embrace hope and life. When a patient goes to the doctor and they hear the big C word, it's cancer. The doctor, as far as I know, doesn't say, take 2 Advil, have a good sleep, and you'll be good in the morning. Oh no. The cure to a drastic illness will have to be equally drastic. Yes, the grace that comes to us is a complete gift. It is free to us, but it was not cheap to God. It cost him dearly. See, just like Ezekiel, Jesus takes a walk as well. It's not through a valley of dry bones. It's up a hill of a skull. Up Golgotha. And there he stares death in the face. And out of his great love for us all, he lets death do its worst to him. He lays down his life. Yes, he does it literally. He dies literally. But as Jill mentioned last week, so much more too. He experiences the weight of all the sin of humanity in his own body on the cross. Yes, Jesus dies this deepest death, and he does it in our place. He stands in for us. As Jesus dies, what does he do? We read he breathes his last breath. Why? That we, like those dry bones in Ezekiel's vision, that we might receive his breath, his spirit, to bring us to life. Just as the first people needed the breath of God in their nostrils to come to life, so we too now, in our utter spiritual deadness, need God's Spirit to come and fill us and give us life. And now by his Spirit, we receive power as well to no longer live self-centeredly, to live in rebellion to God, but we actually have to live out the good purposes God has called us to. Listen how Paul puts it in Ephesians 2:10. You know this verse. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. Notice that word created. Like the first humans, like the dry bones in Ezekiel, we need to be made alive by God if we're going to live the lives that God has created us for, to his glory, to build community, to serve our world, to care about and steward God's good creation, to share this news of life with others. How is it possible? John 20, 21 and 22. Listen to this. This is after Jesus' resurrection. Of course, it was a literal resurrection after a literal death. He says this to his disciples, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. And with that, he breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit. Notice why. If they're going to carry on the mission of God, to be sent as Jesus was sent, they would need the same resource that Jesus had. God's own Spirit breathing life and energy into Jesus came on the first church, and we need that same life to empower us for mission today as well. By God's Spirit, we are empowered to live in a way that brings glory and honor and praise to God. And our time is nearly up, so let me wrap up. Hope for the future. Last night I was reading in Connor's storybook Bible, and we were on the last scene. The scene of the scene of the new heavens and new earth, New Jerusalem, coming to dwell with us. And Connor looks at the picture and says, hey, that's God's town. Yeah, son, that's God's town. Where God's ways are the ways. Where God's peaceful kingdom rule is the way things are for everybody. It's God's town coming down. There is a return from exile. There is a homecoming for you and I too. Listen to how John says it in Revelation 21. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. Yes, Connor, that's God's town coming down. We will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, no more mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Everything. I am going to make it new. One scholar says it this way. The Bible is the story of God reestablishing his presence among his people. I think he's got it right. That is the overarching theme of the Bible. It's a story of God reestablishing his presence. And we have come to know his presence. Jesus came as God with us. And when he left, and this is another question Connor was asking recently, how is Jesus with us if he went back to the Father? Great question, son. He gives us the Holy Spirit. He is present by His Spirit. Yes, God is present with us, but one day we will finally and fully know God's perfect presence in the new heavens and new earth. The worship team is going to come forward, and as they do, I'm going to answer your last question. But Dave, how can I know for sure, without a doubt, how can I know with absolute certainty that God's promise of return from exile, His presence, is true? How can I know absolutely without even being able to doubt it? My answer? You can't. All of us are going to have to exercise faith. You can't know indubitably as though you couldn't doubt it. No, that's not an open option. You could always doubt it. That's a choice you have to make. You can trust God. You can trust His word. And most of all, you can trust His character. That the way God has acted in the past to lead His exiles home when He promised to will be true in the future too. Yes, you could deny it. You could deny that there's even a problem. Or you could just live in despair and say it's all hopeless, it's absurd, I'll just embrace the absurdity. Or you can come home. You can trust His promise. His guarantee is His character. And it's enough. And I choose to trust Him. What about you? Why don't you stand together? We're going to sing in response.